Greetings, digital world, and welcome back to yet another episode of Spliced In Later. We're getting right into it today. Today we are talking about Doctor Who. The reason why we're jumping into it is because normally I get sidetracked at talking about utter nonsense, and I feel like we've got a lot to get through today, and I have the potential to ramble on this subject as well. And because I've been promising this episode for weeks now, but I keep seeing other movies and talking about them instead. And I know that the next week is just going to be pretty much Marvel Central here on Spliced In Later, where we'll be talking about Doctor Strange and Moon Knight. So it's good to get right into it and talk about it now. Now, for my regular listeners, I think I can safely say about half of you like Doctor Who and the other half couldn't give two shits. And I think you'll both be disappointed today. For the people who love Doctor Who, this isn't going to be a in-depth analysis of the show and where I think the show is really good and where it's bad. Or, I mean, you go online, you look, my YouTube is constantly full with these self-indulgent hour-and-a-half long videos where people talk about why Doctor Who as a show has failed, or the fall of Doctor Who, or why it needs to die, or how it's betrayed the cause and ideals of the show, or all these other things from just people who, at their core, I can't tell the difference if they genuinely have this opinion or if they're just disappointed that the Doctor is now a girl. The Spliced In Later is not like that. As you are probably well aware, normally we're a very positive podcast, except for the last couple of weeks where I haven't been. So the majority of talking about this is going to be 95% positive with maybe one or two little critiques as happenstance while I go through the history of the show and just more observation of how the show changed or fit the themes of the years, the decades it was coming out. But I'm not about to tell you which Doctor is the best, which Doctor is the worst, which showrunner is the best, which showrunner is the worst, which characters are cool and which characters suck. That's not happening. This is basically me just going to go back and say, here's the show. What I'm doing is I'm just analysing each Doctor, and barely even analysing. I'm just sort of talking. So that the other half, our listeners here, who don't give two shits about Doctor Who, but who listen to this podcast out of a dedication to me, which I do appreciate, maybe at the end of it you'll be interested to pick up Doctor Who, or at least watch some little bits of it, or at least understand why it's an okay show, or an endearing show, or a show that manages to survive. Because we're getting on 59 years now. Doctor Who will be celebrating its 60th anniversary in 2023. And it's a very, very accessible show because it has changed and evolved and regenerated, if you will, over the decades. You can pick any point in its history run and start watching it from there, and you won't be confused or feel like you're missing out or feel like there's not something you can get onto. It's very, very accessible at any given point. I guess the reason why I've decided to talk about Doctor Who is because I'm in that sort of Doctor Who mood, because this year, our current iteration of the Doctor, the 13th Doctor, played by Jodie Whittaker, her tenure is coming to an end. I had planned for this episode to be released around the time of the Easter special, Legend of the Sea Devils. Things got away from me, but I'm at least managing to get it out before her eventual regeneration episode sometime in November of this year. And the regeneration of a Doctor is always very exciting. It always has different emotions and feelings. You look back on the tenure of for example, Jodie Whittaker. You look back on her time as the Doctor, the story she was in, the companions she picked up, the villains she faced, the tone, the feel, the storytelling. And then you start to wonder what is to come next. Who will be the next Doctor after Jodie Whittaker? Who will she regenerate into? And how will that change the course of the show? How will that change the storytelling, the themes, all of that stuff as well? And then you appreciate that Jodie Whittaker, whether you like her or hate her, or you liked her stories or hate her stories, she was the Doctor for a long period of time, and you have become accustomed, as with the other 12 Doctors before her, to her being in the role, and her face on merchandising, and her logo, and her friends in the TARDIS, and all of that. So you start to look on that in a different view of light, and you start to wonder how she will exit the show. Will she get to go out in a blaze of glory? Will it be melancholy? Will it be dramatic? We just don't know. As of this recording, we certainly don't know, but I'm interested to find out. So enough doodle diddly doodle daddling, all those words that I can't say. Let's go back through and let's basically just talk about Doctor Who. Now, for me personally, Doctor Who is one of my most favorite things, one of the oldest things that I remember liking as a kid, alongside Star Wars and Power Rangers and Pokemon and Spider-Man, those specific franchises, those pop culture icons that first got me interested in movies and television shows and the art of storytelling through the use of film. I didn't get into Doctor Who until it was revived in 2005, and I didn't even start watching that from the start of the series. I started watching it around the 9th episode. I remember I was at my dad's house for the weekend, and there was just one episode on. He had been a big Doctor Who fan for years, but I had been not at all interested for two reasons. One, it was old, and I was a kid, so I thought all old things were boring. And two, the few things that I had seen of Doctor Who, it looked scary. It looked a little too spooky. It looked like it could possibly be a horror thing that I didn't want to get involved into. But the episode that I remember watching, it was the Doctor, the Ninth Doctor, played by Christopher Eccleston, and his companion Rose. They had travelled back in time to World War II London during the height of the Blitz, and there was this spooky-ass kid wandering around town with a gas mask on his face, asking anybody if they were his mother. And while that was happening, people all around him were suddenly regurgitating their own gas masks that were fusing to their head, and they were becoming lifeless zombies. It was a two-parter episode, so the story didn't finish in the first half, and I was so entertained and intrigued by what I saw that when I returned home to my mother's, I asked if next weekend we could watch the second part because I wanted to know what would happen. And as coincidental as you may believe, she, during my weekend where she got to have a break from me, she went to her friend's house for dinner. And that friend liked Doctor Who, so that friend had put on Doctor Who while they were having dinner, and she had the exact same reaction that I did. And we ended up not only watching that part 2 episode, but the rest of the series. And from then, I was hooked. For a long time, it was just the revival stuff. I got excited for the new Doctor that came along after Christopher Eccleston, David Tennant. I enjoyed the Christmas specials and Series 2 and Series 3. And then somebody had heard that I liked Doctor Who and that I was collecting DVDs. So they gave me a DVD called The Dalek Invasion of Earth, which was a Dalek story from the original Doctor Who, the first Doctor's tenure, William Hartnell, back in 1964. And that sat on my bedside table for about a year and a half. I didn't care. I didn't give two shits about that either, because again, I was like, whatever. I like this Doctor Who. That Doctor Who's in black and white. It looks like everything's a bit fake, a bit silly. I'm not going to. But then I think I just had an afternoon where I had nothing else to watch. So I put it on. And it was 6 episodes. And I was like, this is cheesy and silly, but there's a charm to it. There's a certain level of excitement and commitment that I really like. So I watched the other Doctor Who DVDs that had been given to me. And then here we are now. God, I'm almost 30. And I've seen literally every Doctor Who you can possibly watch that is still available in some form today. I've even collected the Doctor Who stories that they have managed to at least salvage the audio from and animated the story. So one day I hope, provided DVDs don't crash and burn, which is very likely, that I will one day have a complete Doctor Who collection. So that's my personal story for Doctor Who. I know everyone has their own personal stories. People of my listeners, either they've liked the old stuff before the revival specifically got them into it. However way you want to look at it, as I said, Doctor Who is extremely accessible. And I put a lot into it for how it has shaped me as a person and my interests in science fiction and movies and TVs and all that. So let's go back and look at Doctor Who over the years, and I'll try and explain it the best I can. Now, Doctor Who first premiered in November 1963. Coincidentally, the same day that JFK was assassinated. Yes, I know, Winston. That's quite the coincidence, isn't it? But that's just a little fact that has nothing to do with Doctor Who, and I just got sidetracked, as I expect will happen on a lot of talking here. But Doctor Who first came about just basically because they needed to fill time on the BBC. 2 very popular shows. I believe one was Countdown. There was a 25-minute window between them that they needed to put something that both kids could access because it was a pre-Watershed Times slot, but also adults might enjoy if they turned the TV on a little before. countdown, if it is indeed countdown. There wasn't a lot of investment put into it, a lot of faith. They basically just needed to come up with something. So through the combined work of a man called Sidney Newman and a woman called Verity Lambert, they came up with some sort of science fiction fantasy show that would help kids learn about history. And what they came up with was bare bones, a goofy old man who lives in a time machine with his granddaughter, and what starts their stories is them and two hapless school teachers who accidentally stumble upon the time machine, set off through time and space, going to the past, the present, the future, to other planets, to other worlds, and getting into all sorts of scrapes. Scrapes that would last for a whole year, 52 weeks of non-stop programming. A lot of stuff going in there for something that was just basically made to fill time. But a few people involved put a little bit more effort in that I think people expected them to. They filled out some of the plot points. They expanded on the characters. The old grandfather-y figure with the time machine, they decided that he would be a mysterious person called the Doctor. We don't know his name, just that he calls himself the Doctor. His time machine is called a TARDIS, time and relative dimension in space. And while it does have a chameleon circuit, which means that wherever you land in time and space, it's supposed to blend in with the background, it gets stuck looking like a police telephone box. So wherever it goes, it still looks like it, whether it's sitting on an alien planet or in ancient Rome, it's a police phone box. Originally, there was not supposed to be alien bug-eyed creatures. It was supposed to just be so kids could learn about the Aztecs or ancient Rome or the French Revolution. But within the very first installment, after the pilot episodes where they went and visited the cavemen, they introduced these creatures called the Daleks, which were everything that Sidney Newman stood against. But these killer machines with little alien creatures inside that shouted exterminate and would absolutely annihilate anyone that wasn't themselves, are very much a homage to Nazi culture and fascism, became almost as famous, if not more famous, than the Doctor himself. The first Doctor was played by William Hartnell, a very, very famous character actor, and his Doctor in these early days before the whole show built on him and his personality and his alien race and all of that, he was just a grumpy old man who was not happy that people were hanging out in his time machine, that thought he was better than everybody else, who was mean, abrasive. There was a heart of gold underneath him who couldn't turn away from people who were in distress, or would find a way to help the less fortunate or people in need. But he was also brought down by an arrogant sense where he thought he was so much better than everybody else, marred by the fact that he could not control this so-called time machine that he was flying around. Means he could not get his friends home, he could not land anywhere he wanted to. And his curiosity, his need to explore, which has always been a personality trait of the Doctor for all his incarnations, meant that he would often get them into danger rather than keeping everybody safe. He lands on a planet covered in radiation and pretends that they need a part to fix the TARDIS before they go anywhere, just so they can go outside and have a look around. He doesn't need that part, but oh no, now everybody has radiation poisoning. He mellowed out over the years, but that grumpiness, that abrasiveness, that less an alien and more a grumpy old man with a bit of mystery behind him was a great performance, and I can definitely see why people fell in love with him and the character. Another staple for Doctor Who is that while the Doctor himself stays on the show constantly, because the show's on non-stop or because there's so much effort or so much work put into these, there was often rotating supporting cast that would come and go. So originally, he started out with his granddaughter Susan, who was just as mysterious as him, and the two school teachers that I mentioned earlier, Ian and Barbara. Barbara was the historian, so she would question or be interested in the things they were exploring, and Ian was the heroic action star, because William Hartnell was too old to be fighting people and dangling off rooftops, so that was Ian's responsibility. As these characters went, they were replaced by other characters which were similar in nature but always had something a little slightly different about them. When Susan departed, she was replaced by Vicky, another young girl sort of character to be the Doctor's substitute granddaughter. When Barbara and Ian left, they were replaced by Stephen Taylor, who was another action star. Vicky leaves, replaced by Katarina, who was an interesting concept that she came from the Trojan War, but was quickly written off when they realized that her lack of knowledge about anything post-Trojan War history would make her operating very, very difficult. Sarah Kingdom, one of those unique companions that was only for one episode, or one story, I should say, not one episode. Dodo, another granddaughter-esque companion character. And Ben and Polly, which were more younger, hip versions of Ian and Barbara. And all these characters, all their personalities, all their traits were very reminiscent of the time they were in, which was the 60s. However, all things have to come to an end, and William Hartnell, though he really loved being the Doctor, he was getting old, he was getting up there, he was having trouble remembering all his lines, he was getting difficult to work with, and it was getting to a point where he had to go because he just wasn't working on the show anymore. Now, Sidney Newman came up with a great idea, which was to keep Doctor Who going because it was a hit. It was Doctor Who culture was sweeping not only England, but the world. So they came up with the idea of regeneration. The Doctor is an alien, and when he gets too old or he's mortally injured in any sense of the word, he doesn't die, he regenerates. And when he regenerates, he becomes someone completely different. So while very sad that William Hartnell was basically forced off his own show, at this point I'd like to recommend, if you ever want to see a really good TV movie, check out An Adventure in Space and Time, which is a biopic movie of William Hartnell's tenure on Doctor Who and the creation of Doctor Who. It's a very emotional thing for something that was put together just to complement the 50th anniversary of Doctor Who. William Hartnell went, Patrick Troughton came in. Patrick Troughton, very, very great, funny guy, funny actor, who really revitalized the tone and term regeneration for Doctor Who. Because I assume the original idea was just that the Doctor would look different, but he'd still be the same person. But Patrick Troughton brought his own personality and his own style to the character. He was more of a clown. He had baggy pants and silly hats. He talked fast, and he'd often seem like he was being a coward or too scared, but really he had plans among plans in his brain, which meant that not only did the Doctor look different, he was a new man. He was completely different. Sure, he had all the memories, and he still had all the motivations of goals of traveling through time, exploring unknowns, all of that. But he was new. He had a new way of approaching things, a new way of engaging with people, and a new atmosphere. And that is why Doctor Who continues to run to this day, even with the hiatuses and cancellations. By changing out the Doctor, the main actor, the main character, still having him be the Doctor, but completely changing that personality and that tone and that approach means it has kept the show fresh, which is something very few shows can do. For instance, I'm watching the 19th season of NCIS at the moment, and I just don't care because 19 years, but it's still the same old characters doing the same old things with the same old approach to things. It doesn't feel like it's evolved or changed. Doctor Who has been on for so long, but you could argue that it's been 5 or different ways of doing the same show. It's different approaches, and it feels fresh. It feels new, which is great. During Patrick Troughton's tenure on the show, he was wrapping up the 60s and the last of the Doctor Who in black and whites. He had some really great companions of his own. I want to point out specifically Jamie McCrimmon, a Scottish Highlander who was in almost every single Patrick Troughton story. There was also Victoria, who was famous that her scream was used to defeat aliens, and Zoe, who was a very clever young woman who was able to figure out plans with the Doctor and was more his assistant and sidekick in figuring out plans to defeat enemies. Not only during that point, but they also really gave birth to the other famous aliens of Doctor Who, the Cybermen, which is a reflection of how people are scared of what the human race will evolve into if we get rid of all of our emotions, upload ourselves into robotic bodies, and become mindless automatons. Patrick Troughton, obviously, he did 3 years. He decided that was enough. Doctor Who jumped into the 70s. There was colour TV. The 70s, obviously, a different style, a different theme. So the Doctor regenerated into Jon Pertwee, the action hero, the James Bond star of Doctor Who. Now, I don't have a favourite Doctor Who in the classic era, but if I had to pick one, Jon Pertwee would probably be the top contender. I think I enjoy his stories the most out of all the Doctors during this time. His tenure was a unique time for Doctor Who because he was stranded on Earth. He had been exiled by his alien species that was revealed to be called the Time Lords. So he was stuck on Earth, meaning that Luckily, that was the time when aliens decided to invade Earth every single week. He was working in conjunction with a Earth super secret spy agency called UNIT, led by Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, who was a very fan favorite staple character for Doctor Who. But this was the time when the Doctor, he would use his judo chop to take out alien adversaries. He'd build crazy gadgets for himself, like the Who-mobile. He would be jumping around, romancing ladies, and in his own charming Jon Pertwee way. And he would focus more on the science side of being the Doctor, per se. It's a unique period, and it takes up a lot of time of Jon Pertwee's tenure. I don't believe he started traveling in time and space again until the last couple years of his tenure. For his companions, he had Dr. Liz Shaw, who was pretty great, but made redundant because they needed somebody who the Doctor could explain his plans to, and Liz was too clever for that. So they replaced her with Jo, who was the exact opposite. She was very ditzy, didn't really understand what was going on or why things were happening. And then towards the end of the tenure, Sarah Jane Smith, which is a nice midway point between Liz and Jo. Sarah Jane is one of the most popular and well-remembered Doctor Who companions of all time, and one of only two that have got her own spin-off show during the revival of Doctor Who later on. Jon Pertwee's tenure also introduced the Master, an evil Doctor Who. Well, basically, he was a menacing Moriarty to Jon Pertwee's Sherlock Holmes. He would show up quite frequently during this tenure in his black outfit and his evil goatee. And whereas the Doctor wanted to explore and help people, the Master wanted to dominate and empower himself. And it was quite a unique repertoire between him and the Doctor, and a great character, which sadly the actor who played him, Roger Delgado, died prematurely. So for a long time the Master was put aside to respect him. But eventually he was brought back during the later classic years, and of course during the revival years as well. And every time the Master shows up on any Doctor that I'm watching, I'm always a little bit more excited than if it were a normal episode, because I do like seeing that dark reflection of the Doctor. And the Master has always been a manic personality that is fun to watch and see what he's got going on in his mind of his. All right, from 1974 to 1981, maybe 82, I'm not quite sure. The most famous classic Doctor began and ran his tenure for the longest of all time, Tom Baker. If you think of classic Doctor Who and you've never watched any Doctor Who, but if you had to try and call to your mind what the Doctor looked like, if you're picturing a long scarf, brown curly hair, and a hat, you're thinking of Tom Baker. Probably the most alien of the classic Doctors. There was a point where no one knew where Tom Baker ended and the Doctor began. He was very zany. He was very cuckoo. He brought in a lot of the tropes that have stuck with the Doctor through post-regeneration, such as his love for jelly babies or his big teethy smile. I personally find his Doctor to be quite, depending on whether Tom Baker's in the mood for it or not, he can either be a really great Doctor or grating. But you can't deny that the reason Doctor Who is so famous and became such a staple during that period is because of his portrayal and his storytelling. This is also a point where Doctor Who became that scary thing that I told you about. When I think of Doctor Who and how it scared me as a kid from what I saw, seeing big green bugs splooch themselves onto human beings, seeing dead zombie creatures coming out of swamp water, quarry monsters, people getting their faces sucked off or their limbs blown up or minds taken over by horrible parasitic things. There was a lot going on during this tenure, enough that people in Britain, especially busybody old ladies, complained that Doctor Who was too violent and too scary. But looking at it now, I think it's great. I love a good Doctor Who story where people die, and it's something that's unique for Doctor Who as well, is that there is a lot of death and carnage, not in a way that will traumatize children, but there is and it is fun when you arrive on a new planet or a new point in history and the Doctor's introduced to all these guest characters, and you do wonder how many of them are going to die horrific deaths in the next hour or so. And half the time it's a majority. The companions that were with Tom Baker during this period were quite plentiful because of his long tenure. Whether it was Harry Sullivan, who was supposed to be another action hero, but Tom Baker turned out he could do his own stunts, so he became a bit redundant. Cave person Leela, who was introduced so there could be a sort of the Doctor teaching her the ways of the world. Very famous robotic dog Canine, who was the best boy ever in science fiction history. Another Time Lord, a Time Lady, that joined on with the Doctor Romana, who went through 2 different phases, 2 regenerations of her own during their period together. And during his last year, where he was about to hand over, he got introduced to the changing of the guard, a really annoying know-it-all brat called Adric, a survivor of a completely decimated planet, Nyssa, and an Australian, Tegan Jovanka, who was also one of the more famous of classic Doctor Who's. I also like Tom Baker's tenure, and interestingly that it's so long that there was not a lot of repetition. These days you could argue that Doctor Who is famous for its famous villains and creatures it encounters. So you don't go too long before he encounters the Daleks, or the Cybermen, or the Master, or the Sontarans, or the Ice Warriors, or the Zygons, all these different very famous creatures, which are good in their own rights. But they do get a bit repetitive after a while, especially if they're used as often as, say, the Daleks are. But for Tom Baker's entire run, he only faced the Daleks twice. I believe he only faced the Master on multiple occasions towards the end of his tenure. But otherwise, every story he encountered, every creature, every villain was brand new. A brand new foe to face, something that writers had to come up with and give backstory and all of that. So that's pretty unique for his tenure, especially for how long he was in the role, and it's a huge staple of that point, and the creativity, the creative juices that were flowing for Doctor Who at that time. When Tom Baker finally regenerated, it was hard for people to let go because he'd been in the role for so long, and then when he was replaced by Peter Davison, who at the time was the youngest person to ever play the Doctor, who originally had been seen as a grandfatherly old man character of sorts. Now he was this 30-something pretty boy in cricket overalls. There was a lot of, we're not sure about this, in the same way of other actors that have taken over the role, being decidedly younger than the people before them. I think Peter Davison is quite great. Of all the mayhem of the 80s and what that was in store for the Doctor, Peter Davison fits into it the most. He's charming, he has a sensitivity to him that we haven't seen in Doctors beforehand, and he is also an action hero in his own right, which I think is pretty great too. For his companions, a lot of them were carried over from Tom Baker's tenure, Adric, Nyssa, and Tegan. He also picked up Turlough, who in an interesting arc was joined up to try and take him down. He was a double agent, but ended up being a good guy in the end. A robot called Chameleon, who they never took out of the cupboard for some reason, so he was wasted. And Perry, who was more of a staple companion for the Sixth Doctor, and suffered from this sense that the people behind Doctor Who thought people weren't interested in the show because it was full of stuffy old men. So she was really, look at this girl in a bikini. This is Perry. What's her personality? She's pretty. Moving on. If you're a Perry fan, I'm sorry about that. During Peter Davison's tenure, they celebrated 20 years of Doctor Who. So they started their, well, they didn't start, they'd done it before, but they did their little special where all the Doctors come together. And when all those Doctors are standing side by side and you see them interacting with each other, you are reminded that even though it's the same person, these are different characters, these are different personalities, different ways of approaching things. And the fact that they're always arguing and getting testy with each other is just great. By the time Peter Davison exited from the role, Doctor Who was starting to get a bit stale, I suppose. There was ratings issues, there was a sense of redundancy, or trying to find new ways to get people introduced. And it started off on a sour foot when the next Doctor to take on the role, Colin Baker, the Sixth Doctor, started out being wildly unpredictable, having a bit of a mental break, strangling his own companions, arrogantly leaving them to die, to manipulate people for his own ego. Now, in retrospective, when I look back at Colin Baker, I actually think he's a pretty great Doctor that was just not written for properly. Putting him in a loud Technicolor coat with him shouting at people and in a ridiculous haircut, sure, that comes off in bad taste. But I don't think that's on Colin Baker's performance. I think that's on the way he was directed by writers and a showrunner that didn't want to be doing the show anymore, but no one would take on Doctor Who. If they left, Doctor Who would be cancelled. Colin Baker's tenure was quite short and full of hiatuses and fears of cancellation and complete zigzags in terms of the tone and feel. But I think he's all right, and I think in retrospect, a lot of people agree with me as well, looking back on it. But of all the classic Doctor Who's, he has the least material to look at in terms of television stuff, so you can't really analyze him too deep. The only other companion that was during Colin Baker's time was Mel, and I have nothing to say about Mel because she was sort of on the show and then she wasn't, and there's really not much more to say about her. Then Doctor Who took a bit of a break. When it finally came back, they did Colin Baker dirty and cast him aside without any sort of, how you going? They said, come back and film your regeneration scene. He went, no thanks. And they went, okay, whatever. But he was replaced by Sylvester Mccoy, the Seventh Doctor. Sylvester McCoy is a unique Doctor. He had a sense of mysteriousness about him, a darkness. They brought in stuff to imply that despite the fact we've been following Doctor Who for nearly 25 years now, we really don't know anything about this man, and that he's been on more adventures that we haven't seen, especially stuff before William Hartner's tenure, and that he's been making plans on plans, and he's been acting battles with demons that have been going on since the dawn of time, compiled with an outfit that looked ludicrous and an umbrella with a question mark on it. So even then, there was still while there was a course direction for the show, they still didn't quite know exactly how to present themselves. He had a great companion in Ace, who was a tomboy action star. She was great, and she was on for most of Sylvester McCoy's time as well. So they had a really good repertoire between them. But the show struggled on for a bit before finally, after a third year for Sylvester McCoy, they just went, that's it, Doctor Who's done. No goodbye, no chance to write a conclusion to the show or anything like that. It was just, we're done. And then for a long time, nothing happened. Until 1996, where somebody went, what if we could make a Doctor Who show for America? What if we could film it in America and have America's budget and have America like Doctor Who? Because America can bring it back, because America is big and powerful. So they created a little TV movie, which was directed to be broadcast for American people, for BBC America. They decided they would pick up a new Doctor. They did stay on good terms with Sylvester McCoy, so he came back and filmed his regeneration scene. And the Doctor for this movie was Paul McGann, who was a ladies' man. I can't say too much about Paul McGann, because aside from this 90-minute movie, he didn't do much else in terms of footage, which is the other thing I want to talk about. Aside from the TV show, there's so much extra content for Doctor Who. The Big Finish audio dramas, the novels, and a lot of these later Doctors I've mentioned that I haven't talked about much, Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy, Paul McGann, even Peter Davison to an extent, have really been built on and expanded in this extra material and allowed to flesh out their characters and their motivations, which is probably why they're a bit more popular now. In terms of the movie, Paul McGann, he's not in it that much, and he's an exciting action hero. We see him a bit more open to exploring romantic relationships with the companions that he encounters, but otherwise he's just the star of the show, and then the movie ends and that's it. He faces off against the Master, which is great, but again, it's a new actor playing the Master, so we get these new portrayals that we don't get a lot of time to really delve into, and which weren't elaborated on after this point. The movie itself, it's a fine TV movie, a fine long episode of Doctor Who, and I quite like it. And I know everybody in England apparently really liked it, but America, the target audience, no one gave two shits, because people didn't care about Doctor Who. So that was that. They gave it a try, didn't work, moved on. And then I guess it must have been sitting in the background there, because around 2003, 2004, somebody went to very, very talented writer Russell T Davies and said, do you want to write a series of Doctor Who for a revival? A brand new revival. You could even call it a reboot of sorts. We'll have a new Doctor, a new companion, a new way of doing it, where it's mainly just episodes with one story per episode, maybe a two-parter here or there. A bit more dramatic, series arcs, all of that stuff as well, designed to directed more at bringing in new fans to Doctor Who rather than, at least for now, appeasing old actors. Russell T Davies says sure, hires Christopher Eccleston to play the Ninth Doctor, hires Billy Piper to play his companion / potential love interest Rose, filled out Rose's immediate family as supporting characters, rebuilt the Daleks, rebuilt the TARDIS. 2005, episode 1, Rose airs and pretty much takes the world by storm. Everybody fell in love with this Doctor Who, with this new way, this new theme, this new brand, and the rest, as they say, is history in terms of new Doctor Who. I've already talked about how I first found this TV show. So there's this emphasis that everybody has a favorite Doctor, and their favorite Doctor is the Doctor they started with, which is fair. That's completely understandable, and I probably think that's true. I would like to say Christopher Eccleston is my Doctor, and as such could be my favorite new Doctor, or at least my favorite of all time. But he wasn't in the role for very long. He was only in for one series, 2005, 13 episodes essentially. We've had companions and supporting characters and villains that have been in more episodes in this version of the Doctor. He was quite cool. He was the cool Doctor in his leather jacket and his northern accent, and he was coming off from this arc where there'd been a terrible time war between the Time Lords and the Daleks, and both sides had been decimated, and he was the only survivor, and it's heavily implied that he had to kill them all to stop the Time War. But there was an essence that meeting his companion Rose, one of the most popular companions of all time as well, that he could learn to embrace life again. But due to production issues, Christopher Eccleston not getting along with certain issues behind the scenes, he took off after his first series and then regenerated into David Tennant. So as people were brand new fans getting into Doctor Who and really liking this character, suddenly this new guy came in, and I was definitely one of those people that went, I like Christopher Eccleston, I don't like this guy, who is this? I don't understand Doctor Who, I've never watched it before, I'm not going to analyze it completely in 20 plus years on a podcast. For Christopher Eccleston's brief time though, really great storytelling. Russell T Davies wrote most of the stories here. The Daleks were made to be scary, like really scary. They introduced some really cool aliens, some really great two-parter stories. The idea of Companion Rose and really exploring what it's like for someone to go travel in the TARDIS but then have a family stuck at home, and how being away and seeing all the stuff that she sees, how that affects her relationships, especially with her boyfriend Mickey, who would eventually become a companion in his own right. That was really interesting. They even tried out a few different tropes. They had a companion who sucked, Adam. They explored what it would be like if they picked somebody up and he just was not a good fit in the TARDIS. And then they explored what it's like to create a fantastic character in his own right, Captain Jack Harkness, who was not only cool and sexy and a big step forward in terms of representation for identity on Doctor Who, he went off and had his own adult TV show spin-off series, Torchwood. I personally think Jack might be my favorite companion of all the companions, but even as I say it, I think maybe not, because I can never make a decision, so we'll ignore that for now. Now, while Christopher Eccleston was and could be considered the man that revitalized Doctor Who, David Tennant is the one that locked it in firmly. His tenure on the show, his 4 years, his charisma, his stories, his suaveness, everybody fell in love with him. He is probably, in many people's opinions, not only the best new Doctor Who, but the best Doctor actor across all of them of all time. He was funny, he was silly, there was still that sense of tragedy, but he was a lot more easygoing and a lot more accessible than Christopher Eccleston's closed off version of it. He went through this whole thing where he just absolutely loved being David Tennant. He loved hanging out with all the friends and people he met, but they would all eventually leave him through tragic circumstances. And he was just extremely likable. He was your bro Doctor. He's someone you'd want to hang out with. He's the Doctor that would come and have Christmas dinner with you rather than quickly run away before anyone even knows he was there. He was the head of some of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever written, some of the greatest new Doctor Who villains ever created, like the Weeping Angels, and just great stuff all around. And his complementary companions as well, whether it's Martha Jones, who had the unfortunate of being the Rose replacement, so she fell for the Doctor in a way that he could not fall for her, but became her own hero in her own right. Donna Noble, I don't really like Donna, but she has her own very popular fan base for being able to mouth off, which is nice, I guess. And then a rotation of guest companions to fill the voids for specials left when companions abrupted, whether it was Jackson, who was a Victorian man who thought he was the Doctor, Christina, an art thief, Lindsay, not Lindsay, that's the actress's name, Adelaide, who was the commander of a Mars base, and Donna's grandfather, Wilf, who is a pure soul, and I love him to bits. The time that David Tennant was the Doctor was the time where I really, really fell in love with Doctor Who, and it was the time when I started exploring the older stuff, the complementary books that came out with it, all the different themes and tropes and all of that. So by the time David Tennant finally left the role, I was heartbroken. It did feel like it was an end of era for me. He started in the role in 2005, left in 2010. So he covered my whole time in high school and college, which is a huge portion of my life that closed at this time. So it's a reflection of a very important point in my life, which is interesting. And it's why when I go back and watch Doctor Who, David Tennant stuff always sticks out for me. He then regenerated into Matt Smith. Matt Smith is also great. No one thought he would be good at it. Everyone went, who's this 29-year-old who's going to be the Doctor? He looks like he should still be in school. Matt Smith brought an alien, whimsical nature to the role. He was like a child in an old man's body of sorts. The way he couldn't understand human emotions or anything like that. But he was a lot of fun, and he had a lot of energy in a way that was similar to David Tennant, but wasn't copying him, as evidenced when they showed up together in the 50th anniversary special, which was mainly the David Tennant and Matt Smith show, but they played off each other really well without being copies of each other, which was great. Matt Smith also had a really good companion lineup in Amy and Rory, a married couple who went through so much shit together on the TARDIS, especially Rory, who became the Kenny of Doctor Who, where he died so many times, but they had a real love and commitment to each other, which was great. And then Clara Oswald, the Impossible Girl, more of a mystery to Matt Smith. She became more of a companion for Peter Capaldi, who came after this, but she was a mystery for him to solve. She kept appearing in different parts of his timeline and dying, and he was trying to figure that stuff out as well. During the Matt Smith era, of course, as I mentioned, we celebrated the 50th anniversary, so there was a lot of self-congratulatory stuff for Doctor Who. There was a peak, a sense of Doctor Who had become a nice midway point between when it started in the revival era of just being its own show and ignoring a lot of that old classic Doctor Who. By Matt Smith's tenure coming to a close, they'd really ingratiated a lot of classic Doctor Who into there as well. So they were referencing things, they were bringing back old stories to close. Anybody who likes any part of Doctor Who could look at an episode in Matt Smith's time and go, this is an episode from a show from both periods of the time, which is the perfect transformation for a show that in 1989 everyone went, this has nothing left to offer, let's just let it go. Matt Smith regenerated into Peter Capaldi. Peter Capaldi went back to the grumpy Doctor Who era, the old man. He was abrasive, he was rude, he really didn't mind telling people that he didn't care about them. His relationship with Clara suffered as a result of that, but it was interesting seeing her attempt to mellow and lighten him out and him learn to grow and accept and all of that stuff as well, which is interesting when you look at a character that has regenerated 12 times at this point into 12 different personalities, and he still manages to do and say things that surprise you, which is great. I personally really like Peter Capaldi. His tenure, while still good, it suffers from a bit of all over the place. I don't know if the people behind it were ready to move on to something else, or if they were trying to be more clever than they needed to be. But there was a lot of, look at us, we're so clever, look at these crazy things we're doing, aren't we dark and mysterious and smarter than you, which I personally had trouble getting through. But I stuck with it because Peter Capaldi was a great Doctor. And every now and then there was that gem of an episode that was just so good and reminded you why Doctor Who is still a great show. Plus the companions, still great as well. Aside from Clara, we had Nardole, played by Matt Lucas, when he first was introduced as just a guest character. I absolutely hated him. And when they announced that he would be a companion, I thought, okay, right, so Doctor Who's going to be cancelled soon. But Nardole ended up being a staple, a fan favorite, and for me personally, a really great, interesting, alien-type companion for the Doctor. Just this little bald guy who just followed along after everybody and had a smart comment to say about everything. And Bill, I thought Bill was great, but suffered from Clara being in the main companion role for too long, and with Peter Capaldi on his way out, they didn't give Bill much time to do much before she was written out. But she was a great personality, which I thought was good too. And then finally, Peter Capaldi regenerates into Jodie Whittaker, which was way too controversial. It shouldn't have been as controversial as it was. The Doctor is an alien from another planet. And yes, he is regenerated into men most of the time, but just because he regenerates into a woman, it becomes this whole thing of like, all our favorite sci-fi characters. It's all about representation for the sake of whatever. He's a guy. He can't regenerate into a girl. It's just not okay. It's representation where it doesn't need to be. I personally think for a show that's nearly been on 60 years, having him regenerate into a girl is just the right level of creativity juices and fresh and throwing this stuff up there to make it fresh and new and to keep people interested. And I personally, having watched Jodie Whittaker since 2018, I believe was her first adventure, her first story, I've never once watched her and gone, I can't see this as the Doctor because it's a woman now. Because the Doctor has been so many different personalities, so many different things, that I've never really thought of him as a man. He's an alien. He is an alien who changes constantly into these different personalities and personas. And the idea that one of them is a woman makes absolute sense to me. And Jodie Whittaker is fantastic. She has her own uniqueness, her own zaniness, her awe and wonder at being a woman is interesting, but also the way she approaches problems is with a sense of wonder, while also revitalizing the show in a way that apparently not a lot of people agree with, which is why you'll see all that stuff about the fall of Doctor Who and whatever, where they've been revealing all this stuff that potentially changes everything we knew about Doctor Who. And that's good. Keep that shit coming. If you were revealed tomorrow that the Doctor is actually a ascended being from above the universes, I'd be all there for that, because it'd be something new and interesting to keep you in the story. There's this point where people just decide, this my character, my regenerating non-sexual alien gender thing needs to be these things, and it can never be anything different, and if you do that, you're breaking the show and I hate you. And yeah, that's fair for other shows. If you have an established character on a show like Chicago Fire, a fireman that is very brave, and then one day he's a coward, yeah, okay, be annoyed at that. That's fair. You're not writing the character correctly. But this is, as I said, an alien on a long-running TV show where multiple showrunners, multiple main actors, the show has changed so many times and revitalized itself that this current arc I'm really for. And the fact that it's making so many people angry makes me even happier. So that's fine. But yeah, Jodie Whittaker, great. I'm looking forward to seeing how her tenure ends. I've enjoyed her companions, whether it's Graham, who's a nice, mature companion, a grumpy old granddad in his own right. Ryan, who was a bit of a unsure mama's boy in the beginning, but became a real superstar in his own right. Obviously, there's stuff going on with Yaz at the moment, the current companion. She's a great individual, smart hero in her own right that has this romantic tension with the Doctor. And lovable John Bishop as Dan Lewis, the newest companion, who's just this average guy who's just completely confused as to why anything's going on and what's happening. If I were any companion in Doctor Who, or at least my personality, it would be Dan, because I would just be like, what's going on? I don't understand. We're in pirate time. Should I put this eye patch on? I think I will. Oh, I'm not supposed to wear it? Oh well, I've got it on anyway, so why bother taking it off? Great, love it. I'm worried that when Jodie Whittaker regenerates in the next coming months, that both Yaz and Dan will go. I mean, it makes sense. They're getting a brand new showrunner, but Dan hasn't been around long enough for me to really feel like we've appreciated his character mostly. So I hope at least Dan can stay on for the next Doctor. But that's the fun part. That's what sums up Doctor Who entirely. The fun part is that you never really know what the show is going to do next. When there's a new regeneration, when there's new characters, new stories, you can never start a Doctor Who season or series or tenure and go, I can guess exactly where this show is going to go. I know exactly how it's going to play out. I know what they're going to do here. I know what they're going to do there. It's a complete mystery. Whether Doctor Who powers on for another 10 years, another 50 years, if it has its own crisis and hiatus and cancellation and comes back, I think at the very least, the last, I'm going to round up and say 60 years of Doctor Who have been great television, a great representation of sci-fi storytelling in television. It is a good showcase of how to keep ideas fresh and new, of how to let people put their own creative juices into characters they play with all the different personalities that have gone into the Doctor. And it's comfort stuff for me specifically. I love watching an episode of Doctor Who. If I'm going to go through and watch it all from start to finish, or if I'm watching a new episode that shows up on Christmas Day or New Year's Day, it's good comfort food that I really like. And there's been so much of it that I feel like I've gone on a journey with Doctor Who as it's been made. And with that, I'll wrap up. I don't know how many people are still here. I don't know if they got annoyed because I didn't criticize Doctor Who, or if they got annoyed because I'm talking about Doctor Who and they don't care. But it's been quite the episode. It might be my longest one. That's not a ranking. So I'll wrap it up now because we must be getting sick of hearing me talking my voice, my stupid, annoying voice. However, I will be back with my super annoying voice tomorrow because I'm going to watch Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and I can't wait to review that. I've had to jump off social media because apparently, unlike Spider-Man No Way Home, where they kept everything a secret, they're determined to try and spoil it for me before I get there. So I hope I make it. So I'll be there tomorrow. Tune into that to see how I feel about the movie. Spoiler alert, I think I'll like it. But otherwise, you know, you've listened to me talk about it for 50 odd minutes. Why not go watch an episode of Doctor Who? Or if you have been watching Doctor Who and you're behind on a few episodes, now might be the time to catch up. Until tomorrow, I love and appreciate you all as always. Stay safe, stay kind to one another, and I will catch you on the flip side. You've been spliced in later. Adios, muchachos. I'll catch you next time.